Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak to you, and thanks for turning up despite the weather here in Belfast. This is what I want to cover today. I want to first of all give a bit of a background of how we got to where we were. I think it's important to give a context of how fiscal powers were devolved to Wales, how we got to reforming the Barnett formula. And I want to talk briefly about the reforms, both on the spending side and on the tax side. I'll spare some of the finer technical details, but I'm guessing because you've signed up to the seminar that you won't mind a bit of nerdery or wonkery. And then I'm just going to give an overview of an assessment of the fiscal framework, how it's worked, and the strengths and weaknesses in Wales. I'm going to talk a bit about the actual budgetary effect that it's had on the Welsh Government budget so far. You're going to have to forgive me if I come over a bit, triumphalist, or a bit smug about how it's turned out. It's not often that somebody who works on economic and fiscal matters in Wales has a good news story to tell. This is perhaps the best news story that no one's heard of outside of the handful of us in Wales who take an interest in this stuff. So I said this is going to be a more cheerful presentation that I usually give on the fiscal outlook for Wales. And then, lastly, as promised, I'm going to look at some of the lessons and conclusions that I think that Northern Ireland can take from the Welsh experience so far. I should say on that point that both the Fiscal Council and the Fiscal Commission have produced reports that look in detail on the technical side of things, and it really covers all that ground really well. Perhaps I've got some thoughts maybe on the politics and the implementation of how you can get perhaps fiscal devolution off the ground here. Just as a bit of context, the first steps towards the fiscal devolution in Wales started in 2007 with the coalition agreement between Labour and Plaid Cymru, the One Wales coalition. They established the Halton Commission in 2007, which reported in 2010, specifically to look at the issue of underfunding, which I'll talk in a bit, and it recommended a package of tax devolution for Wales. Similar along the lines of the Calman Commission in Scotland, which had already been set up by the UK government. Then the UK government set up the Silk Commission in 2010, the coalition government, with representatives from each of the Senate parties trying to come with a package of tax devolution. So the first part of that report focused on fiscal devolution. Then these were enacted then in the Wales Act 2014, which devolved smaller taxes to the Welsh Government. And the Wales Act 2017 crucially removed the referendum requirement for income tax devolution. So there used to be a referendum clause that the Welsh Government would have to call and win a referendum if it wanted for income tax to be devolved. I often say that it takes about an hour to explain tax devolution, so I'm not quite sure how that referendum would have worked on the doorstep of people having to comprehend exactly what was being devolved. I think it would have been a very difficult referendum to win for the Welsh Government. And then, lastly, before that Wales Act into power, before it got legislative consent by the Senedd, there was a fiscal framework negotiations between both of the UK and Welsh governments, and that's really established how tax devolution would be implemented and the reform of the Barnett formula that I'll talk about. That was a crucial part. So in terms of the political context of passing that Wales Act, those negotiations really secured that funding deal for Wales, and that's the reason why the Labour Party in particular supported the devolution package in the end. So maybe the point the reason I've gone through this is first of all to make the point that it takes a long time. I was still in school when the Halton Commission reported, and tax devolution has just got off the ground over the recent years. Secondly, it's important to get buy-in from political parties, from all political parties, that there's some consensus, particularly around that Silk Commission report, and there was a St David's Day agreement between the parties that tried to come to a common ground on tax devolution. And then lastly, the political context at the time matters. So as I said, this reform went hand in hand with wider reform of devolution in Wales, particularly with the Wales Act moving from the conferred powers model to the model of the reserve model of reserve powers model of devolution. So it's come about because of a wider change in the devolution settlement. The other part of the context that I want to mention is the idea of underfunding in Wales. It's quite an historic grievance that the Welsh political or Welsh policymakers have had for decades. Wales is usually at the bottom of the pecking order when it comes to grants being distributed across the devolved nations. And this shows it's a lot going on in this graph, but I took it from the Fiscal Council report that looked at the Treasury's estimate of relative need in 1979 and 1994, and then I've updated that with the Halton Commission estimates of relative need. So the need is of the squares. As you can see, Wales was the one part of the UK that had funding below its relative need. So 100, that's all relative to England spending per person. So Wales was slightly below its estimate of relative need. During the 80s, there was a big rise, perhaps, in deprivation in Wales, a big rise in relative need in Wales compared to the English average. But funding didn't increase in line with that. It increased a bit, but there was still a big gap in funding between the estimate of relative need and estimated spending on devolved services or on public services. And then the Halton Commission was the key to the report that really gave impetus to the calls for reforming Barnett, for the Barnett formula. And at the time, the Halton Commission estimated a funding gap of around 150. Estimated relative needs was about 15% higher in Wales compared with England and Northern Ireland. And at the time, in 2010, Welsh funding was about 113% of the English level. So that gap was about £300 million. And it became a really big clarion call for Welsh policymakers, Welsh politicians to reform the Barnett formula. It was quite ironic because that report was published in 2010 and we didn't get another estimate of relative spending levels until we published an estimate in 2016. And in the meantime, relative spending had actually diverged away from England. So it was, found it quite ironic that the Halton Commission published its report right at the period when, after a long period of convergence in relative funding down towards the English levels. And I won't go into the sort of maths behind the Barnett formula, but in terms of the levels of public services spending that you end up with after the application of the Barnett formula over time is really just the result of an historical accident. It's what you got in the previous year plus a change because of from the Barnett formula each year, and what you end up with in terms of relative spending levels is determined by your initial levels, obviously. So if you've got an inbuilt advantage, you sort of keep that over time. It depends on comparable spending growth in England. When spending grows quite quickly, the Barnett squeeze effect that you might have heard about happens quicker. So that was particularly the case during the first decade of devolution for Wales. And it depends on relative growth in population. So when your population doesn't grow as quickly as England, it means that your block grant needs to be spread around fewer people. And that means that relative funding per person over time, because it increases. That's because the Barnett formula only updates the change and not the overall previous block grant, which is the main part of your block grant in any given year. So the big sort of turning point, which coincided with the publication of the Halton Commission report, it was a major turning point. One, because of slower growth in spending and actual cuts to public spending, which causes divergence in relative funding levels, and the Welsh population began growing at a slower pace compared to England, particularly, as you can see here from that chart, particularly around after the point of the last census. The Welsh population has grown significantly slower than the UK, and that means that the block grant needs to be spread, as I said, across fewer people. So it really, ironically, underfunding almost solved itself by accident. didn't stop the then Welsh Conservative Secretary of State, Alan Keynes, claiming that it was his proudest achievement to get a settlement that gave £120 in the pound for every £100 spent in England. That was mainly because, as I said, the workings of the intricacies of the Barnett formula being applied over time. But as I said, Barnett reform was still very much a political issue over that first part of the last decade. And then the 2015 spending review provided a guaranteed funding floor for Wales. So it said that the UK government would not allow relative levels of spending to fall down below 115%, which it basically took the Halton Commission's estimate of relative needs and said that it wouldn't allow funding, it would always top up funding to 115% if it were to fall below that level. And then the 2016 agreement was the key document, which set out actual reform of the Barnett formula. You think about the existing Barnett formula as it used to apply. So the change in spending in England, the comparability factor, the degree to which that spending is devolved, and then the population share of that. And then the new element was added to all changes to the Welsh budget to the needs-based factor. And that needs-based factor was set at 115% to reflect the different the higher levels of need, reflecting the Halton Commission's recommendations. But because of spending was higher than 115% at the time, it was actually set at 105% for a transitional period, which will become 115%. So it's adding a 5% each year to that, to those consequentials or changes in funding, and that means that the convergence in relative funding is essentially slowed by that additional top-up that you get each year from through the Barnett formula and the needs-based factor. It's quite ironic again that they call that a transitional period, because based on population growth, relative population growth, reasonable assumptions about UK government spending growth, that transitional period will last forever at the moment. So, over the next 40 years, we're not expecting any substantial convergence in relative spending with that extra 5%, because of the fact that the Welsh population is growing at a slower pace. That could change, obviously. It's based on sort of historic growth rates. But again, considering that the Barnett formula itself was meant to be a temporary stopgap measure, it's quite ironic that they've introduced another temporary fix. It's quite indicative of the ad hoc way that things get reformed in the UK. What it has achieved, though, is significantly more funding for the Welsh Government. That extra 5% at the time, when it was announced in 2016, spending was set to grow relatively slowly, so we didn't think there would be a massive boost for the Welsh Government. And then along came COVID, with massive spending through the Barnett formula, massive additional consequentials, and 5% of a lot is a lot. So you're talking about £250 million during 2020, purely because just of that extra 5% that you got. And that's been building up every year. So you think that over the 7 years, it's about £1.2 billion, about £390 per person, and about £240 million next year. It's not exactly, I'm not 100% sure of this calculation, but it's just an estimate based on the Treasury data. It's quite difficult to know what's included in the baseline, etc. But this might be our best estimate of how much funding, additional funding the Welsh Government has got as a result of this needs-based factor of 105% and not at 115%. So the other big change to the way the Welsh Government's budget was funded was tax devolution. And if you think about the share of total spending in Wales that is under devolved local government control, it's about over half. It's about 55%. That at the time, before the Wales Act, the share of devolved tax revenues, which were under devolved control, were about 5%. So that was the other major criticism of the way that the Welsh Government was funded, of course, was autonomy, around the questions around autonomy and around financial sort of accountability and empowerment, and the sort of vertical fiscal imbalance that this sort of picture implies. After the Wales Act, Wales has sort of moved upwards with more revenues. The share of Welsh revenues being under the devolved controls, about a fifth of revenues are now, of all tax revenues in Wales, are under the Welsh Government's control. So in terms of exactly what those were, the full devolution of business rates that you have in Northern Ireland and Scotland already, the devolution of smaller taxes, stamp duty and landfill tax, and then the big portion of that is the partial devolution of income tax from 2019-20. You also have some powers to create new taxes, and I believe that Northern Ireland has something similar, but that the Welsh Government have been quite frustrated with the process of having to prove or the process of trying to introduce a new tax in Wales, because it is subject to the UK Government agreeing and both houses of Parliament agreeing to that, and they can set sort of barriers or limits, and the Welsh Government need to fulfil before they allow the competence to introduce new taxes. So I said Scotland has gone further up that chart towards over a third of revenues now being under devolved control. Northern Ireland, they obviously with the devolution of social security is further along the right of that chart, of course. Similar, I am going to try and populate this with more international examples eventually. I did get some data easily available on Quebec, which has a similar level of devolved spending as Northern Ireland, but with about 8 times the share of revenues under devolved and local government control. So yeah, just to say that yeah, this is a countries much closer to that 45-degree line where revenues equals devolved revenues equals devolved spending shares. In terms of the Welsh rates of income tax, I just want to quickly talk about how it was partially devolved to the Welsh Government and the Welsh Government's model of tax devolution. So at each of the rates paid in income taxes in Wales, the UK Government tax rate fell by 10% in the pound, 10p in the pound. And that created room for the Welsh Government to introduce its own tax rates in each of those tax bands. If it set a tax rate of 10%, that means no change in the tax paid by Welsh taxpayers compared with those in England and Ireland. If it moves that away from 10 pence that in the pound, that means yeah, there'll be tax differences and differences into the Welsh budget. Crucially, the thresholds are still reserved, so the personal allowance and the higher and the additional rate thresholds are still reserved to the UK Government. And I think that's the major difference between the Welsh powers and the Scottish powers, who've got full control over the non-savings, non-dividends proportion of income tax. And in terms of the usability of these powers that I'll talk about later, these are much more restrictive powers compared with the powers that the Scottish Government have used in terms of creating new bands and lowering some the lower rate bands and then creating a new middle rates as well. So it's they make more extensive use of more usable powers probably. But even if the Welsh Government doesn't change tax policy or income tax policy, tax devolution will still have an effect on the Welsh Government budget, and that's because the block grants needed to be adjusted in some way. I'm sure that you're familiar with these with these sort of questions of how the existing block grants should be adjusted to reflect the new devolved taxes. And it comes to the core of the question of what risks the Welsh Government should be bearing. Should the Welsh Government be accountable for any changes in the Welsh tax base? So essentially, it means that the Welsh Government's basic rate revenues in Wales need to keep pace with basic rate revenues in England, Northern Ireland, the higher rate and etc. So the higher rate revenues in Wales need to keep up with higher rate incomes in England. And that means that UK-wide factors which affect or impact different parts of the tax base asymmetrically is already sort of automatically accounted for, or partly automatically accounted for, which is a key part or key difference between Wales and Scotland. I think a lot of the perception of the Welsh Government taking on tax powers was one of dread, almost. I think by most policymakers in Wales, the assumption was that we'd lose out over time as a result of tax devolution. In fact, current forecasts suggest quite a significant positive effect of tax devolution on the Welsh budget, especially if you account for reconciliations for previous forecast errors in future years. So income tax, the block-on adjustment and tax revenues are sort of fixed in years. So there's no in-year risks for income tax. And then it's sort of adjusted 3 years once we know the outturn data. So we take those reconciliations into account. We think the net positive effect of tax devolution on the Welsh budget is about £289 million in 24-25, and that's almost equivalent to a 1p rate increase in all income tax rates in Wales without changing tax policy at all. And that's in sharp contrast to Scotland's experience, who have, as I said, made extensive use of the income tax powers that it has. The Scottish Fiscal Commission estimated that the income tax policies raised an additional £750 million from 2017 to 2021. However, the slower growing tax base in Scotland meant that additional revenue through tax policy was sort of reduced because of the slower growing tax base to about £85 million. So the net effect of tax devolution was much smaller than the actual increase in tax policy. So there's a big difference in the experience of tax devolution in Wales and in Scotland so far. So given an overview maybe of assessing the fiscal framework and the Fiscal Framework Agreement now that it's been operational for a few years. First thing to say is that it was a very good financial deal for Wales, and I guess the timing of it couldn't have been better in terms of much higher than expected spending increases than we would have expected at the time. And I think at any other point during the history of devolution, had income tax been devolved, I don't think that we'd have seen faster growth in income tax revenue. So it was a particularly opportune moment in time for the Welsh Government to take on income tax powers. If you look at the actual effect that has on the overall size of the Welsh budget for day-to-day spending, this shows the real terms change since 2010, adjusting for inflation. It's about, by next year, we think, on the tax and on the spending, the additional space factor side as well, it's about 2.5% of the day-to-day budget next year. Of course, it's obviously a help, and it's obviously a good thing for the Welsh Government to have that built into its budget. But if you really look at the trends in the Welsh day-to-day budget, it is still the UK government's fiscal decisions which has the big impact on the size of the Welsh Government's budget. The big trends of austerity and the recovery in spending is being driven by the UK government's spending decisions. So as I said, a good financial deal for Wales. And again, it's created some link between the relative performance of the Welsh economy and it offers relatively strong protection against macroeconomic shocks that affect the whole of the UK. It survived the COVID crisis quite well, or dealt with the COVID crisis quite well, I think. There is a question, I guess, of how far the Welsh Government is responsible. If the idea was to create a link between the Welsh economic performance and the Welsh budget, how likely is it the Welsh Government has done something that has increased the size of the tax base, or is it something like what the UK government freezing the thresholds, which has pushed more, has created a higher fiscal drag effect in Wales relative to the UK? And again, the reverse of that, Scotland saw slower growth in its tax base, primarily because of higher paying jobs in the northeast associated with the oil industry. that had an asymmetric effect on Scotland. Was that the fault of the Scottish Government? I think that's questionable. So yeah, there was full equalisation of the weaker tax base for Wales, but that's not going to be updated to reflect changes in Wales's tax capacity over time. So that sort of adjustment is fixed at the point of, so any sort of divergence away in terms of tax capacity from now on is not going to be adjusted from it. So it's working in our favour at the moment. But most countries, subnational countries, and from an international perspective, have some sort of insurance built into the system over time that sort of equalises levels of tax capacity over time as well as from the beginning. So that makes it quite unusual. And on the spending side, the Treasury did for the first time admit that, or gave, conceded that there was higher levels of need for public spending in Wales for the first time. But the updated formula still determines the changes each year and not the overall size of the block grant. It's only the changes in each year which gets determined. So the relative funding per person that you end up with is still sort of influenced by a mix of historical accident, trends and relative population growth, and the rate of growth in spending in England. So it's not a totally rational way of introducing a needs-based system. It's only partially addressing that. And the needs-based element is based on already a decade-old assessment of relative need published by the Halton Commission. Some of that data is based on the 2001-1991 censuses. So that's not that. That's fixed in time, and that's not. Some countries might want to update the needs-based element over time. That's not something that's built into the Welsh Fiscal Framework. And if the whole purpose of tax devolution was to increase the autonomy and accountability of, that was the language that was being used when income taxes were being devolved, I think it's questionable whether that's there's been an actual step change in the fiscal accountability of the Welsh Government. I think it's questionable whether the current powers allow the Welsh Government to meaningfully diverge away from UK government spending and UK government fiscal policy. The usability of the Welsh style powers can be questioned, especially compared to Scotland, having to change the big tax rates or the headline tax rates instead of being able to use the thresholds makes them a lot less usable, I think. And in terms of the nature and interest in the Welsh budget setting process, I don't think there's been a step change in that either. And the big test in terms of electorally, so the idea was that this would allow Welsh political parties to put forward different tax and spending choices. It might be just the feature of the Senedd election in 2021 at the height of the COVID pandemic that changed the nature of that election, but tax just did not feature at all really in that election. So the Labour Party said that they wouldn't change tax rates as long as the economic effects of COVID were still with us, which was, I think, vague enough that they, meaning that, in practice wouldn't contemplate using the income tax powers. The actual major tax policy that's happened in Wales over the last 10 years or so is on council tax. And I think because the Welsh Government has allowed local authorities to increase council tax at a faster rate in Wales than in England and in Scotland in particular, and that's set to be reformed. So I guess that's a perhaps lesson that even with the big change in the devolved taxes or the basket of taxes under devolved and local government control, it's the council tax that's seen the biggest change or the biggest divergence away from what's happened in England and Wales. Just a small point in terms of the budget management tools, which I think is also an important part of the picture. So they did create a Wales reserve, which allows the Welsh Government to pay into a reserve and to draw down funding over years. But if you actually look at the limits placed on the use of that reserve, it's actually not that more generous than the budget exchange facility that the Welsh Government already had. It's already been eroded significantly by inflation. Those limits are set in cash terms, which doesn't really make sense and need to be revised. And also from the Welsh Government, in terms of the size of its devolved revenues and the size of its devolved budget now, you can argue that there's significant scope for additional borrowing powers in terms of revenue and capital spending, it does have some capital spending, but in terms of how affordable that additional borrowing would be, I think you could increase those limits substantially, which would give more freedom for the Welsh Government to set its own course in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of managing its budget from year to year. And then, as always, there's still procedural complaints that the Welsh Government has in terms of that the Treasury is still sort of judge and jury in its own court when it comes to the Barnett formula and the statement of funding policy. A big issue for Wales has been over recent years the classification of HS2 because of rail infrastructure spending not being in a devolved area, HS2 being classed as an England and Wales project, despite HS2 not coming through Wales. It's been a big, again, a grievance that the Welsh Government and Welsh policymakers have been complained about and tried to address, but so far that it's remained as an England and Wales project, which means that the Welsh Government doesn't get a share of the additional spending, the additional consequentials as a result of HS2. I said that this presentation would be more cheerful than what I usually give, but it would be remiss of me not to mention the big pressures that the Welsh Government budget is under this year and next year as it sets its budget for next year. There was an emergency financial statement in October which reallocated money away from different portfolios into the health service of £425 million. A big cash injection for the Transport for Wales budget because passenger numbers haven't recovered. It does mean that next year we are looking at cuts being made across the budget, especially with not enough money to be able to fund a similar cash injection to the NHS next year potentially. So across the budget, all areas of the budget, we are seeing reductions being made, or will be seeing reductions being made. I think we were talking earlier, the difference between the Welsh budget will actually still be, for day-to-day spending, will still be smaller in 2026-27 than it was last year. So the higher levels of inflation that we've seen, the unexpectedly high inflation, has eroded the Welsh Government budget by at least about £800 million next year. Depending on which measure of inflation you use, that could be a lot higher. Yeah, and as you all be familiar with the winter pressures on the NHS, the big pressures facing Welsh councils, the outlook isn't great. Lastly, just to finish, I'd like to talk about or offer some lessons and conclusions for Northern Ireland. I guess the main takeaway would be that poorer peripheral countries can take on fiscal powers successfully. It takes a bit of luck, and I don't think that we knew when we signed up to these powers that it would end up being a fiscal boost. But I guess it can be it has been a success, I guess, but it's unlikely to change the longer term economic and fiscal trajectory as well in terms of from a Welsh perspective. Questions about the lower levels of economic activity and economic policies in general need to be addressed. The longer term fiscal plan as well, the fiscal outlook as well needs to be debated in terms of public services provision going forward. I'm not expecting a UK-wide conversation for reform, from working from first principles. I think we're likely to carry on with these asymmetric deals that we see across the three different countries. We've now got different ways of calculating the block-run adjustments, different ways of different taxes under devolved control, and different ways of calculating the block-run adjustments for each of the devolved countries, which is quite ironic that the Treasury say that it prefers simplicity, but this is a very complex picture now across the UK. But precedents are useful, so I guess you all are interested in what's happened in Wales, and Wales in turn was very much interested in what was happening in Scotland at the same time. Just a quick point in terms of the importance of developing capacity in this area. This has been a question for Northern Ireland inside the executive. let's just say, I guess, that there's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation there, that hopefully these powers will mean that the executive develops more capacity in terms of developing fiscal policy once the powers are in place. I think that's been the experience in the Welsh Government. We've got a very they built up a very capable large team in the Welsh Treasury, which now does a lot more work around fiscal analysis and economic analysis. I guess in terms of why I say the outside of the executive is important as well, because scrutinising fiscal policies is an important part. And I actually think that Northern Ireland are ahead of Wales on that point, with the establishment of the Fiscal Council and what the Fiscal Commission did last year. I'm trying to make the case at the moment for the Welsh Government maybe to invest in a similar body in Wales, similar to what the Scottish Government have in Scotland with the Scottish Fiscal Commission. But having an arm's length body that puts out data and analysis, objective data analysis, is a crucial part of this, which I think that Northern Ireland and the Northern Irish Fiscal Council does well. I think added to that, I guess, is that politics, both inside of Northern Ireland and externally, matters. The crucial lesson from Wales, I guess, on that front is that it needs buy-in from different political parties, that they signed up to a common goals when they go into negotiations with the Treasury. And I guess the context and timing of the negotiations are important. If you think back in December 2016, when the Welsh Government was negotiating with the Treasury, it was just after Brexit. It was perhaps the UK Treasury was at its probably institutionally weakest at that point. It might have something to do with why Wales perhaps got a decent financial deal at the time. But I guess, and I think crucially in terms of the politics of the negotiations, the Treasury had one eye as well on what was happening in Scotland. They were going to renegotiate the Scottish Fiscal Framework in a few years' time. And I think the Welsh Government taking on population risk was a key factor for the Treasury in offering then a sweetener perhaps on the spending side, and a sweetener in terms of adjusting for tax capacity with separate block grant adjustments. So the overall timing and context of negotiations is important. I realised that I'm the expression trying to teach a grandmother to suck eggs in terms of negotiating with the Treasury. Northern Ireland has been successfully much more successful than Wales in terms of getting additional funding from the Treasury, using the political capital that it has. Those have been traditionally shown one-off short-term deals. And I guess, again, there is a question of whether you devote the energy and the political, expend that political capital to try and get something longer-term reform that boosts fiscal sustainability over time, and that's built into the block grant baseline. So I'm going to finish there. So diolch yn fawr. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm going